On March 17, 1943, inside a quiet office lined with dark wood in Berlin, a German admiral held a report that seemed almost unbelievable. It was just a single sheet, a summary of raw intelligence, yet its contents were far more explosive than a 1,000-pound bomb. This report didn't reveal a secret weapon or a hidden army. Instead, it described a factory, an American factory across the ocean, that was expected to be producing a 4-engine heavy bomber every single hour. To the men in the German high command, it sounded like a joke, a piece of outrageous American propaganda. But for the spies who risked everything to collect this data, it meant something far grimmer. It was a death sentence written in numbers. That day they realized with chilling clarity that the war was slipping from their grasp. This is the story of a devastating truth too terrifying for Adolf Hitler to accept, and how ignoring a single fact would ultimately doom the Third Reich. At the core of the Nazi intelligence apparatus, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris stood out. As the head of the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence, he was a man devoted to hard, unvarnished facts. Unlike the fanatics around Hitler, Canaris was a seasoned professional. A career naval officer, a patriot from an older generation, he viewed the world not through ideological distortions, but through the lens of strategic reality. His loyalty lay with Germany, and his duty was to deliver the truth, however grim. His organization, the Abwehr, was a vast network of agents and analysts across the globe, the eyes and ears of the German military. In the early war years, the Abwehr had been crucial to Germany's blitzkrieg successes, supplying intelligence that allowed the Wehrmacht to outmaneuver its foes. But by early 1943, the mood in Berlin had shifted. War was no longer a string of triumphs. The catastrophe at Stalingrad had shaken the German high command. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet army was pushing back with terrifying power. In North Africa, Allied forces were steadily wearing down Rommel's famed Afrika Korps. The tide was turning. Yet at the top, a dangerous illusion of invincibility persisted. Hitler, holed up in his wolf's lair, was increasingly disconnected from reality, surrounded by yes-men who filtered out bad news and fed his delusions. He believed that the German war effort depended purely on willpower. The German soldier was superior. German science was unbeatable. Victory was inevitable. Into this echo chamber of self-delusion, Canaris was about to deliver a harsh reality. He understood the brutal math of war. Modern conflict wasn't just armies clashing, it was an economic battle, a deadly equation of steel, oil, and aluminum. From his position at the center of an intelligence network spanning the globe, he was beginning to see numbers that horrified him. Numbers that showed Germany wasn't merely losing the production race. It was on the brink of being crushed by an industrial juggernaut beyond its comprehension. This intelligence didn't arrive in one moment. It crept forward gradually, compiled from a dozen sources. It began with whispers from German agents in neutral countries. A businessman returning from the US spoke of a factory so enormous it seemed to have its own weather. A diplomat in Washington mentioned production targets that seemed to have an extra zero. A Swedish engineer sent a coded report about an aircraft assembly line moving at the speed of car manufacturing. Each report alone could be dismissed. But as the intelligence funneled into Abwehr headquarters, Canaris's analysts saw a terrifying pattern. They all pointed to the same place, a vast industrial complex in Michigan called Willow Run. And they all repeated the same almost unbelievable claim. The Ford Motor Company was using automobile mass production methods to build a 4-engine B-24 Liberator heavy bomber. The goal wasn't to make one a day, or even one every few hours. One bomber every single hour. To the Germans, it was inconceivable. The B-24 Liberator was a colossal machine, an 18-ton giant of aluminum and steel made up of more than 1.5 million parts. German factories, celebrated across Europe for their engineering, often required weeks or even months to build a heavy bomber like the Heinkel He 177. The notion that the Americans, a nation mocked in Nazi propaganda as chaotic and racially mixed, could assemble such a complex aircraft in just 60 minutes was not only unbelievable, it was an insult. Canaris and his officers did the calculations. If the Americans could actually achieve this, one bomber an hour meant 24 in a single day, over 700 in a month from a single factory. At that time, Germany's entire aircraft industry struggled to produce even a fraction of that number in heavy bombers. The spies confirmed the facts. The intelligence was verified. Even Japanese naval attachés, allies of Germany, were sending reports on American production with a tone of sheer dread. The numbers were real. But how could it be? How could a workforce made up of women, African Americans, and immigrants, people the Nazis considered inferior, achieve this? How could a democratic nation, often chaotic, organize with such relentless efficiency? In the Nazi worldview, strength came from racial purity and strict authoritarian control. America had neither. Therefore, the reports had to be false. A massive deception, surely. Anything else was too terrible to imagine. It meant the war was no longer decided by soldiers or generals. It was a war of factories. And if the March 1943 report was accurate, it meant Germany had already lost. As one Abwehr officer put it, if these numbers were correct, then the war was already over. It was no longer a matter of willpower, it was a matter of mathematics. Half a world away, the impossible was becoming real. On a stretch of farmland in Michigan, a colossal structure had risen, the Willow Run Bomber Plant, the very embodiment of what President Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. Nothing like it existed anywhere on Earth. Designed by industrial architect Albert Kahn, its main hall was a single room so immense it was hailed as the largest in human history. It stretched for more than half a mile. To avoid paying taxes across 2 counties, the assembly line took a peculiar 90-degree turn, with partially completed bombers rotating on giant turntables, a feature later known as the tax turn. But the real revolution was the philosophy inside. Henry Ford and his production chief, Charles Sorensen, had made an audacious promise. They would build airplanes just like they built Model Ts. The traditional aircraft industry laughed. "You can't expect a blacksmith to make a watch overnight," sneered one executive. Ford and Sorensen proved them wrong. They broke the B-24 down into manageable sub-assemblies. Each worker was trained for a single repetitive task. One drilled holes, another riveted panels, day after day. This system allowed the plant's apprentice school to train thousands of new workers every week. And who were these workers? They directly contradicted Nazi ideology. At its peak, Willow Run employed over 42,000 people. Nearly a third were women, the iconic Rosie the Riveters, operating rivet guns and welding torches. One of them, Rose Will Monroe, became the real-life inspiration for the Rosie propaganda figure. The workforce was a true reflection of America. Over 9% were African American, another 3% were disabled, all working side by side. They labored in shifts 6 days a week, creating a relentless 24-hour hum of production. This was the very mongrel society Hitler loved to mock. And yet, it was about to outproduce the so-called master race at a pace that defied belief. The early days were difficult, earning the factory the nickname "Will It Run?" But as 1943 progressed, the operation hit its rhythm. Raw materials went in at one end, and at the other emerged an 18-ton heavy bomber ready to take flight. This wasn't propaganda. It was a new kind of warfare, a war of industrial power. And America was wielding a weapon the Third Reich had no answer for. While German scientists chased futuristic rockets, the US was perfecting its deadliest weapon of all, the assembly line. Armed with this chilling reality, Admiral Canaris faced his greatest challenge: breaking through the ideological fortress surrounding Adolf Hitler. It was a wall built of arrogance and willful ignorance, with its chief architect being the second most powerful man in Germany, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring. Göring led the Luftwaffe, Germany's air force. A flamboyant World War I ace, he saw himself as the ultimate authority on air power. He was also deeply corrupt and profoundly egotistical. More than anyone else, Göring nurtured the myth of the Luftwaffe's invincibility. When Canaris presented the Abwehr's findings on Will It Run, Göring's response wasn't concern, it was laughter. The reports were dismissed outright. "Americans cannot build airplanes," he famously sneered. "They are only good at refrigerators and razor blades." And this wasn't just a throwaway comment. It perfectly captured the Nazi worldview. To them, Americans were a nation of shopkeepers, a decadent, consumer-obsessed people. A mongrel race lacking the discipline and martial spirit of the Germans. The idea that such a society could mass-produce a heavy bomber was, in Göring's mind, utterly impossible. He dismissed the reports as clumsy American propaganda. You can imagine how maddening this was for Canaris. He was presenting mathematical certainty to a man living in a fantasy. Canaris pressed the issue, detailing specifics: the mile-long assembly line, the specialized tools, the immense capital investment. But Göring refused to listen. He and his inner circle had their own narrative, an article of faith. To challenge it wasn't just to question a military assessment, it was heresy. Accepting Canaris's report would mean admitting failure. It would expose the blind spots in his intelligence and reveal that the Luftwaffe was about to be swept from the skies. And so the report went nowhere. It was buried beneath Göring's colossal ego. The wall of denial held firm. Canaris possessed a truth that could have saved Germany, but no one in power was willing to hear it. The next step would be the most critical: delivering the information to the one man who mattered, the Führer himself. Presenting facts at Hitler's headquarters was a perilous and peculiar endeavor. Whether at the Berghof in the Alps or the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, the air was heavy with paranoia. Reality was whatever Hitler decreed. Military briefings were less about strategy and more about confirming whatever the Führer wanted to believe. Into this theater of delusion, the facts from Willow Run were a ticking time bomb. Hitler's perception of the United States was a strange mix of contempt for its culture and grudging respect for its size. He saw it as a mongrel nation, weakened by racial impurity and dominated by Jewish financiers. When confronted with the Abwehr's production figures, the projections of one bomber an hour, more than 650 a month from a single plant, Hitler's reaction mirrored Göring's, but with pure venom. This wasn't just a matter of military strategy, it was a personal affront to his ideology. The numbers were declared inflated, fantasies, Jewish propaganda. His own armaments minister, Albert Speer, a man who truly understood production, would later admit under Allied interrogation that if the Willow Run figures were even half accurate, Germany was doomed. But speaking this truth in Hitler's presence in 1943 would have been suicidal. So the great confrontation never happened. It was a collision between reality and ideology. And in the Third Reich, ideology always won. The Admiral's warning wasn't just ignored. It was labeled defeatist. The men who brought the facts were seen as weak. Their patriotism was questioned. In Hitler's mind, war was a test of will and blood, not logistics. A single sheet of paper, representing the dangerous work of dozens of spies, was brushed aside. It contained the most crucial strategic fact of the conflict. The enemy's industrial capacity was growing faster than Germany could hope to match. The decision wasn't made by command. It was made by stubborn blindness. The truth was rejected. The spies were dismissed. The Admiral was silenced. And in that moment of supreme ideological denial, the fate of millions was sealed. The consequences of ignoring reality were inevitable. They first came as a distant rumble, then a terrifying roar that filled the skies over the Reich. Believing their own hype, the German High Command made a string of disastrous errors. Resources continued to flow into Hitler's pet projects, the Wunderwaffen, or wonder weapons. The V-1 flying bomb and V-2 rocket, while advanced, were strategically negligible. The Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter was revolutionary, but it came too late and in too few numbers. They simply didn't have time, because the prophecy of Willow Run was coming true. Throughout late 1943 and into 1944, the trickle of Allied bombers became a flood. The U.S. 8th Air Force launched relentless daylight bombing raids. At the center of this campaign were the B-24 Liberators. The planes rolling off the assembly line in Michigan now dominated the German skies. In February 1944, the Allies launched Big Week, an all-out assault on the German aircraft industry. Thousands of bombers, many from Willow Run, pounded factories across Germany. The Luftwaffe scrambled to defend its homeland and was systematically destroyed. German pilots, however brave, were simply overwhelmed. For every German fighter downed, only a trickle of replacements arrived. For every American plane lost, 10 more crossed the Atlantic. It was a brutal war of attrition, exactly as Canaris had foreseen. The cities Göring had promised would never be bombed were now reduced to rubble. One Luftwaffe general, frustrated with Göring's detachment, wrote in his diary, "The Reichsmarschall lives in fantasy. Yesterday, 1,000 American bombers destroyed Linz. He still insists they could not have built so many aircraft." The B-24s, produced in the largest room in human history, were now dismantling the Third Reich, piece by piece. They shattered factories, tore up railways, and obliterated oil refineries. The German war machine, starved of fuel, began to grind to a halt. The unstoppable Wehrmacht was being subdued by the output of a single factory its leaders had mocked. So what happened to the man who tried to sound the alarm? For Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, telling the truth carried a heavy price. As the war turned against Germany, his sober warnings marked him as untrustworthy. In Hitler's paranoid court, realism often looked like treason. His rivals in the SS saw the Abwehr as a nest of unreliable, old-world aristocrats lacking true Nazi zeal. They watched him closely, waiting for mistakes. His accurate reports on American production weren't merely ignored. They were treated as proof that Canaris himself was spreading enemy propaganda. He was trapped. To do his job was to seem disloyal. But Canaris's opposition ran deeper. Horrified by SS atrocities, he used the Abwehr to protect members of the German resistance, including the theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Secretly, he worked to prevent Spain from joining the Axis, a covert act of sabotage that cost Hitler dearly. The final blow came after the failed July 20th, 1944, plot to assassinate Hitler. The Gestapo investigation uncovered the extensive opposition network, and many trails led back to the Abwehr. Canaris was arrested. His personal diaries were discovered, revealing the full depth of his resistance to the regime. On April 9, 1945, during the final chaotic weeks of the war, a vengeful Hitler issued the order. At Flossenburg concentration camp, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, stripped naked, was slowly strangled to death with piano wire. It was a brutal, humiliating end for the man who had seen the future with perfect clarity. He was killed by the very regime he had tried to save from its own blindness. He delivered the warning, and for doing so, he was erased. When the guns fell silent in May 1945, the final numbers proved just how right Canaris had been. The report that landed on his desk in 1943 wasn't just correct, it understated the reality. The final tally from Willow Run was staggering. At its peak in 1944, the plant was producing a B-24 Liberator, not every hour, but every 63 minutes. By the time the last plane rolled off the line, Ford had built 6,972 complete B-24s at Willow Run and produced another 1,893 knockdown kits for assembly elsewhere. Think about that. A single American factory produced more four-engine heavy bombers than the entire German aircraft industry managed throughout the war. It wasn't even close. Across all its factories, the US built over 18,400 B-24 Liberators, making it the most produced heavy bomber in history. From 1940 to 1945, the United States manufactured over 300,000 military aircraft, while Germany produced roughly 94,000 combat planes. American industrialist William S. Knudsen summed it up best. "We won because we smothered the enemy in an avalanche of production, the likes of which he had never seen or imagined." The German failure to act wasn't due to poor intelligence. The spies did their job. They delivered the facts. The failure was one of acceptance, a complete cognitive collapse at the highest levels. The Nazi leadership couldn't process information that contradicted their fanatical ideology. Blinded by their own propaganda, they simply refused to believe the numbers. They were defeated not by a secret weapon, but by arithmetic. They were buried under a flood of steel and aluminum, forged by the very people they had scorned. Men and women of all backgrounds, working together in a free society. The spies were right. The Admiral was right. March 17th, 1943, was the day the truth arrived in Berlin, and no one in power was willing to hear it. Stories like this show that history often hinges on moments far from the battlefield, in quiet offices where a single piece of paper can change everything. If you love uncovering the hidden stories that shaped history, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation. It helps us enormously if you like and share these videos with anyone who enjoys a good story. In the end, the story of Willow Run isn't just an interesting World War II fact. It's a chilling reminder of how any government, group, or even one individual can be blinded by what they want to believe. The Third Reich wasn't defeated from lack of information. It was defeated because its leaders chose prejudice over facts. They built their worldview on the shifting sands of racial mythology. When the tide of mathematical reality came crashing in, the entire structure collapsed. The conflict between the Abwehr's grim reports and the arrogant dismissals of Hitler and Goering was a battle for the soul of the German war effort, a clash of evidence versus fantasy. Fantasy won, and in doing so, doomed the entire enterprise. Willow Run, meanwhile, stands as a monument to the very things Nazism sought to destroy: the power of a diverse, free society to innovate and mobilize on a scale totalitarianism could never match. The factory floor was a microcosm of the Allied cause, a chaotic, seemingly inefficient, yet beautiful collaboration of humanity that, when united, achieved the impossible. The legacy of that March 1943 day still echoes through time. It is a stark reminder that the most formidable walls are not made of brick and mortar. They are the ones we build in our own minds.